Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SFT Podcast. I hope you've subscribed. Now is your chance. Subscribe now, and then we'll get going. It's a bit of a special one today. We're not going to be ranting on about what we've been up to this week. What we're actually going to talk about is the idea of harmony, and in particular around the sort of Amazon Prime documentary that's gone out about the king's relationship with harmony. And Patrick has been part of that through the whole process. Now, Patrick, tell us a little bit about your sort of history around harmony and also your relationship with the king going back a very long way now.
Yeah, I do think, just to say, that Finding Harmony, A King's Vision, the documentary, which is an hour and a half documentary, which has been made in the last year, which elucidates and illuminates the king's, as was the Prince of Wales's, philosophy and intuitive understanding of the interconnectedness of things, is an incredible film. It's just one film, but actually in a world where things are so dark and difficult at the moment, it's quite a positive. It leaves you feeling, well, it left me feeling really inspired and energized, because I think the lens through which he has actually always looked through to understand the world is it connects everything he's ever done. I'll just go back a bit, because I've actually known, I first met the prince in 1982, right at the beginning of when he had acquired some land around Highgrove, which is about 200 acres of parkland, but he wanted to farm more in his own right. And so he approached people who were already farming in a sustainable way, including David Wilson, who was recruited. He came from a conventional farming background, and he was asked at his interview, did he want to try some biologically sustainable farming? And he didn't have a clue what that meant. So he said, yes, as you do at an interview. And then that turned out to be, after the prince had kind of investigated various options with people that he knew were already in the field, including myself, but actually most notably, a man called Professor Hardy Votman, who was the world's first professor of alternative agriculture at the University of Wittenhausen, a castle in Germany, and known as the Biopope, because he was the first in. And so he went and connected with Hardy. Hardy came over to the UK. And at that time, there was a place in Berkshire called Elm Farm Research Centre, which was run by a man who was a friend of mine, Lawrence Woodward. And the prince went to Elm Farm, and I was one of those invited to meet the prince as he was, and to talk about our experiences in organic farming. So that's how I first met him. And what happened over the years since then was that because we connected, and I'd been farming about 10 years then organically, but then along the road had got involved with the whole organic project and been involved with developing standards and all the rest of it. Almost immediately after that, I think it was in 1985, started converting the Highgrove Farm, initially in a few fields round the back, which nobody could see because they weren't sure it would work. And then as they got more confident, more and more, and then eventually, I think about 5 years later, they took the decision to convert the whole farm. That's just a tiny lens of insight into how he told me once, out of his intuition, knew he had to do these things. And the Highgrove project, which turned out to be one of the most influential organic farms in the world, I would say by a golden mile, was born out of his wish to do things in harmony with nature. So actually, even though organic farming is what he became widely known for as one of the leaders of the sustainable agriculture movement, behind that thinking and its application in agriculture was the whole cosmology, really. And in 2010 or around then, he mentioned to me more than once that he was writing a book called Harmony. And I have to be honest, when he first said that to me, I thought, what's he on about now? This is yet another of these sort of harebrained projects that he seemed to keep coming up with, like, talking to plants or all the other things that he got ridiculed for. But it turned out that I think his Harmony book and the philosophy behind it was probably the most important thing he's ever done, because it wraps around all the sustainable projects he's been working with over the years, whether it's architecture or education or the built environment or integrated medicine. They're all connected by these sort of overarching laws of maths and geometry. And so the book, which was published in 2000, had a few critical reviews, but actually nobody noticed it, which is so fascinating, isn't it? That he was so far ahead of his time that it just passed unnoticed. And funnily enough, Christy Brown, who is on our board, decided that nobody much was buying the book, so she bought all the copies that were remaining, and gave them to us. So we've got about, I think, 40 or 50 of the only copies of Harmony, the original book, in the SFT offices in Bristol. And even for the film, which is quite interesting, the book indeed didn't even get mentioned in the film. It's almost as if, I don't know why, it's an interesting point, but anyway, the Harmony cosmology and philosophy, it's basically an amazing lens through which he encourages us to look through to try to understand the world in which we find ourselves. And if I'm honest, I think I had a kind of magnetism towards that cosmology from quite an early age, and I think a lot of us have. It's almost as if we know that we're living in this strange world we find ourselves beneath the clouds, metaphorically speaking. And above the clouds, the sun is always shining. And if only we could see above the clouds and see the miraculousness of the world we're living in, and also understand its interconnectedness, maybe it would completely change our lives. So ramble, ramble, ramble. Summary, what he's given us, the king as he now is, to quote the subtitle of the Harmony book, a new way of looking at our world through the lens of geometry, of maths, and of interconnectedness. And just to give you a couple of examples of that, it turns out that everything is lawfully connected with mathematics. And you know about the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio, and the way in which you can see a cyclone or a weather system in the Atlantic which hits our shores. Turns out the Fibonacci sequence is in the spiral there. It's also in the human ear. It's also everything in our bodies is actually connected in a mathematical and geometric way. And then if we look at nature, every flower has a number of petals, 5 petals, 6 petals. These are all geometric shapes which are reflected absolutely everywhere in nature. And it's as if it's like a revelation, really. You suddenly realize that we're not separate from nature. We are part of nature. That everything in our lives is connected through these fundamental laws. As you can see, I've drunk his Kool-Aid big time.
I completely agree. Like, but that whole idea it's wildly complicated. And to be honest, I think everyone around sort of struggles with that. We actually talked about this earlier today, about the fact that we've got all these plans around the world of how we can, we know we need to fix nature. We know we need to sort of move our food systems forward, move our health system forward. But it's so complicated. It's almost too much for us to deal with. And therefore, we can't move forward with it because we're trying to do it in such a, maybe, I don't know, deliberate analytical way, when really we just need to work with nature. We always separate ourselves. And you are very forward in saying you would rather do land sharing rather than land sparing. Would that be fair?
Yeah,
food production.
I think you can say it's complicated. In a way it is, but if you can connect all the things that we experience through a common framework, then it suddenly becomes both beautiful and complex and understandable all at the same time. So it's rather like our digestion. You could say our digestion is extraordinarily complex because there are so many organisms involved. But then if you understand the sort of principle of it, that it's, the microbiome principle, which is the interconnectedness of the digestive system, then suddenly, even though it is complex, it becomes fascinating. So I think the revelation of the Harmony philosophy, which is not new, it's as old as the ancients who understood these things. It's as old as all the faith communities. The ancients understood all these principles. The pyramids, I mean, they're just the art of the great cathedral builders. They understood the maths and geometry of the buildings. In fact, they built them with the specific intention of influencing the people who visited them to change their state. So really, this is rediscovering ancient wisdom and principles which have always been in the world, but sometimes sort of disappear underneath our visible witnessing of the world. And probably from around the time of the Enlightenment, when we decided we had dominion over nature rather than that we were part of nature, that heralded in the new, quote, scientific age, in which we wanted to reduce everything to its component parts, and we didn't understand these interconnected laws. And so we're just now maybe emerging from a very long chapter of human history where we reduced everything to its component parts. So to your point about land sparing and land sharing, so this is about whether we want to change agriculture in harmony with nature, or we want to say there's nature here and food production there. Yes, that's a very good example that if we simply compartmentalize everything and we see everything in a siloed way, then we'll get it wrong. So it's holistic in its approach, and it is spiritual as well as physical. And I think one of the things we've wrongly done is we've separated our inner spiritual search from our relationship with material reality. Because, of course, in fact, the two are absolutely connected. The whole thing is about energy, the energy that communicates between people, emotional energy. It's just a process of, some things are material, some things are less material. Science now has discovered that. So I think it's a massive gift he's brought us. It's incredible. And if you look at some of the studies in the film, what Shoshona Stuart has done in Afghanistan is mind-blowing, because basically she went into Afghanistan before everyone was thrown out and had to get out in a hurry because of the Taliban, and helped restore the ancient art of those Islamic traditions. And then when everybody had to leave in a hurry, they kept her on because they realized that she was helping them, rebuild their ancient culture. And so even though you could say she's incredibly vulnerable, and the Turquoise Mountain project, which features in the film, is pretty crazy of her to stay in Kabul and do what she's doing, she's fine. And isn't that fascinating in a time of conflict, where that's an example of where an understanding of these ancient traditions can heal wounds and rifts and even wars?
Yeah, that is a fascinating part of it, I think, really. I think we get very hung up on the idea of division everywhere in the world, and someone's right and someone's wrong, but really we're all trying to preserve our natural state of how we feel comfortable. And even the Taliban, who obviously have interesting views, let's just say, extreme views, they're trying to preserve something. They're trying to preserve a feeling of belonging. They're trying to preserve that human innate nature of trying to fit in their environment. And so if you can help them preserve that, it's the same as a honeybee trying to preserve its hive. Everyone is trying to preserve that sort of feeling of belonging.
Bees are a good example, also featured in the film. And that's Bristol Prison, where the chaplain goes in and looks after the prisoners, and they brought beehives into the prison, and the prisoners are just completely blown away and inspired by the harmony that exists in every beehive. And the hexagonal shape of the honeycomb is a very interesting example of the geometry of nature. And of course, the bees communicate with each other in extraordinary ways and tell each other where to forage and all that kind of stuff. And I think what is also interesting, you bring this up, is that obviously, self-evidently, there is conflict in the world. And so how do we make sense of the world in which we find ourselves, and also embrace the fact that there is conflict and darkness, which is in all of us, but particularly prevalent in certain individuals at the moment, and it always has been. But how can we move towards harmony, away from the disharmony, which seems lawfully, for reasons which I certainly don't understand, to manifest all over the world and always has done? I mean, that's maybe a question we can't answer, but you can feel that moving back towards harmony is the right direction to strive for.
Where do we start? I think, these are massive questions, Patrick. They're massive. It is a huge thing. Don't get me wrong. It's something that which we should all be striving towards. But where do we start? Does it start with our food? Does it start with our health? Does it start with nature on its own, separately from food? What would you say we should do next?
Well, I think it starts with influences. I think we can say that as we grew up, you and me both, there were certain influences in our childhood that we fell under, which everyone falls under. Some of them are just the accidental influences of life. The weather's bad, the weather's good, or we live in a beautiful place or we don't, and stuff happens. But then there are certain influences which touch us more deeply. And I don't know why it is that that's the case, but I can certainly think, if I think back to my childhood, one of them was going into a cowshed when I was 5 years old with my mum. And it was something about the atmosphere and the smell, which is quite interesting. So these were impressions. They weren't what I learned from a book. They were experiential, but also classical music. My dad was a great lover of the music of Bach. So I grew up with Bach's music. And there's no question about Bach. he was a man who had higher knowledge, whatever that means, which is reflected in his music, which of course there's maths and everything in his music. The meaning of life, I'd argue, is in his music. And so I think those childhood influences collect in you. And eventually they lead to a search for something. And I think that search can take a spiritual direction. I mean, in my case, I became interested in Eastern teachings, as well as the relationship between Eastern teachings and the Anglican Church. And I also became interested in how to make sense of those finer influences in my subsequent life. And that led me into farming and organic farming. But I think the two are not separate. And I think that's one of the amazing things that the king has now done. He's made this search more acceptable and even legitimate for people who hitherto have kind of said, well, I've got my life in the world and I'm going to make a lot of money out of farming and, that's my day job and all that sort of thing. Whereas I have a personal life. Maybe I go to church or maybe I meditate or maybe I do these sort of spiritual things, but they're different. They're not part of my life. And I think what he's reminding us of and calling us to understand is that they're not separate. Nothing's separate. So if we have that aspect of ourselves in a search, I'll call it, and a search for the sacred, both inside ourselves, but also in the world, that is absolutely connected with our strivings in life. And if it hasn't been during this short chapter of extractive agriculture or industrialization of everything, as we saw in the film with those horrible examples of cities, which are just ghastly, then we need to move back to harmony. And so I think if you say it's about agriculture, are you saying, well, what did it for me? Yeah, it's agriculture because that's what called me. And I think it's relevant to our conversations because obviously we all eat. And therefore, the relationship between the story behind our food and our health and all those things has a very important direct effect on us. But it also has a finer level, a more spiritual level. And of course, people like Rudolf Steiner, who was another man who had, quote, higher knowledge. He brought biodynamic farming into the world. And that is a kind of bridge area as well, isn't it? Where he said farming was chemical, should be biological, but actually should be even more than biological. You should take into account the finer influences, the planets, of homeopathic preparations, of that kind of thing, and integrate them into your practical life. And I think, so the harmony message, I think is a message for our time. I think he is a king for our time. I think he is in the world for a reason. And back in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and even the noughties, he was in the world, and yet the world didn't recognize him. But now I think it's time that he should be recognized because he deserves it.
Yeah, I think he was always seen as an outlier, as in the film, a hippie. You said it, he was seen as that. People did throw him aside as someone who's laughable in many ways. But I think we're catching up to that. Well, I say there are many, many other people. He just happens to be incredibly public in his figure, of course. And so, it's great that lots of people are now catching up. It's interesting,
Yes.
Patrick, you said all the things that have influenced you. And a lot of them are the same for me. I find spirituality, difficult to grasp as a concept that I really buy into. However, I also have the same things. So I find music really, really, I need it in my life. I need to have that around me or I get unhappy. I used to work away and in cities quite a lot. And then I've moved back to the farm and I feel way more relaxed, way more happy in my surroundings. I notice things that are around me and I care for things in a different way. More developed and more compassionate way. And I think that affects us all in different ways. And the way we describe it is different. But I think we all have those things that make us feel connected and happy for different reasons. And I think they all come back to this harmony thing. And whether it's helping others, to try and bring someone else into your little network of happiness and interconnectivity. So yeah, I think you've struck on something there, which is quite important. And I think, like you said, the king has been on that.
You bring up music. I mean, music is vibration. So there we are, and there's the octave, which is a mathematical progression between do to do. And there are also two semitones in the octave. And then do you know about the Pythagorean comma, which is basically...
I don't know that one.
Well, that's about how if you go do to do in an octave, there is a slight discontinuity of vibrations. In other words, it's not a perfect doubling of the octave. Isn't just double the the
No.
vibrations of the lower C, as it were. And so even in music, these laws are manifest. And apparently, if you go to Chartres Cathedral, if you've ever been there in northern France,
No.
the design of the mosaic and the floor of the cathedral is reflecting this Pythagorean comma and the discontinuity of vibrations. So how interesting that, could we today have the wisdom and the deep understanding of nature to redesign, a Gothic cathedral like Chartres, or all the English cathedrals are unbelievable, as don't forget St. David's, which is also an amazing cathedral. The point is, these people knew something, and it wasn't just about, how to build incredible stone cathedrals. It was deeper than that. So this idea that they were trying to influence people or help people be influenced by higher knowledge simply by being in those buildings and praying is so profound, I think. I come from an Anglican background, although the teaching I'm involved with is a sort of fusion between Eastern and teachings in Christianity. But I find that I now go to evensong quite often because I find that the rituals and the sacred nature of the evensong service, especially when it's sung, especially even more when it's in a cathedral, is profound. Because you're tapping into vibrations of song, of sacred rituals, which have been performed every day in the case of, say, Westminster Abbey, where I go quite often, for 1,000 years. And the architecture is it's as if it's resonating and holding all those vibrations and feeding them back to you when you're in a better state of, as it were, prayer or meditation. So I think these are just examples of accessible practices in daily life which are completely harmonious with what we're trying to do, say, in the field of agriculture. And I think that millions of people are ready for this. I think there's a shift of consciousness going on. I think a lot of young people are very anxious, understandably. They're born in a world of climate change and where they're taught in primary schools that we've got real problems. But what can they do? And I think when you find this interconnectivity, which is what we've been discussing really, it's so helpful because it enables you to feel, well, okay, the world might be in a dark and dangerous state, but I can find my place in it, understand that in microcosm, in my own body and my own being, are all the laws of the universe. And somehow, I'm just speaking personally now, I find that incredibly helpful in my own journey through life.
I think that's fair. And I think it goes across all fields too. So it doesn't really matter what you're interested in. My partner's an architect and he's really interested in biophilic architecture. And this is exactly the same thing again. So it's like all this sort of interconnectivity of space, the way you live in space, and actually mostly in commercial architecture. So the way you would work in a space, the way you are, and hospitals in particular. So the way that you feel when you go to hospital and the way that you feel
That's very
around
interesting. So
those types of things.
Is biophilic architecture related to what we've been discussing? That's fascinating.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is it taught? Did he study it?
Only in passing, but absolutely is moving into doing more study around that. It's become, in fact, I think it's probably partly my my obsessive sustainability hat, always talking about these things. But and I love to build as well.
But that's everything. So, that's it. Yeah. It's state, isn't it? If you're in a hospital and it influences your state, if the building, as you know, that woman, Professor Kathy Willis, she said that if patients in hospitals have trees outside their windows, it substantially accelerates their healing.
That's right.
I mean, of course, the space in a hospital is going to affect your state. It's obvious, isn't it?
That's right.
So how wonderful if he's into that. And even better if you're an influence on him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and also we get to play with those ideas. I love building. So we've built, I've sort of rebuilt my house recently. I've built another house a couple of times. And we do a lot of building on our own farm around restoration of old buildings as well. So we're working with cob. So which is like an old mud, straw, that kind of building material. And sitting in our farmhouse, which is mostly made of cob and stone from the land just outside, that is an incredibly relaxing, wonderful place to be in that farmhouse. Walls are a meter thick. And it's not just the fact that it's old. It's the way that it's built. It's the history that goes into it, the feeling of that weight around you, feeling comfortable and cool and all those types of things. It has a huge relationship. Building those old practices into modern architecture and like you just said, having that wonderful English cottage garden. People love that English cottage garden outside their house. It's not because it looks pretty. It's because it makes them feel connected a little bit to nature, some sort of nature that they can sort of have a little bit of control on, I suppose, but also they can just feel that they're part of it all. And I think there's lots to be learned from that.
I think there is, and just to call it out again, the prince, as he was onto that 40 years ago, and he set up schools, and he's designed new towns like Poundbury, and he realized way back that vernacular architecture and buildings were a reflection of place, and exactly as you just described, they reinforce your sense of belonging and rootedness in place just by living in the buildings, and the vibrations of these materials, the stone from the place, the earth, the cob, everything helps you understand the world in which you find yourself, because in fact those materials are what your body's built of as well. And this idea of localness and a sense of place is all related to that, isn't it? So I think he's giving us a great gift. And it's so interesting that in the film itself, there's a couple of interviews with very unreconstructed architects who are, I don't know how they feel being in the film. I was thinking about that. I found my own thing a bit excruciating. And to your point about me saying that Jamie Oliver said he was a bit of a hippie, and I brought that out in the film. I thought, God, am I doing him a disservice? But in a way, the point is, he was so criticized for so long for all the things he did, and ridiculed even. And I'm so glad that it's all come round now. And I think it's very manifest in the film that he is actually a lovely man, an extremely sensitive man, and a caring human being. And God, the world needs that at the moment, doesn't it?
Yeah, gosh, yes. I mean, I don't know the king very well at all. I mean, I've only met him once when I went to St James's Palace this last year, and only met him for a second.
Was that to do with your Nuffield scholarship, or what was that to do with?
No, that was to do with a project called Innovative Farmers, and so that's paid for by the King's Foundation, and which is then funded by the Duchy brand. And so they'd got to a milestone of 50 million for projects. And so I was brought along as an innovative farmer because I run a few trials projects, and I got a loud voice. So I'm always useful to have around to talk to people. So I got to meet him for a moment there, just a few moments, but you could tell instantly that he's a very interesting. He was interested in the projects we were doing and knew a bit. And I love that. That was a really interesting part of it. So, but you've had many conversations.
I think you put your finger on it. He has good attention, and he is genuinely interested in things and listens. I've noticed that, he goes into a room like when you were there at Clarence House, maybe there's 100 people in groups, and he kind of works the room, as it were, which just sounds like a process. But what is amazing about him is he tends to leave everyone with something which he's noticed, or something out of his interest in what you were doing, which sticks. I think for him to do that is pretty amazing. And it's not just because he's good at it, it's because he really does have good attention.
Yeah, it's amazing. That convening thing is the great power, I think. And I know David Wilson quite well, his old farm manager, and he said to me a few times, it was crazy. We're doing all this stuff, and suddenly we were convened in this room, and I'm surrounded by some of the most powerful people in the world, and talking about my organic farm that I'm running with the prince at the time. And, suddenly we've got this huge thing going on, and it's so exciting. And that he had such praise for him as well as, as a boss, I guess. And they call him the boss.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned Highgrove again, but when I was at the Soil Association, we asked whether we could use the Highgrove Farm and Gardens as a stage for one-day visits. And basically the formula was we'd invite a bunch of people to come. And typically, if you said, would you like to come to Highgrove, people tended to accept this invitation. So we had the most extraordinary, diverse alumni of interesting and influential people over all the years I was at the Soil Association. And then when I moved to the Sustainable Food Trust, we said, could we continue with this? And he immediately said yes. So the format was, we had about, say, 25 to 30 people. We'd arrive at Broadfield Farm, Duchy Home Farm, in the morning, have a kind of coffee and introductory chat. Then David would take us round the farm, either walking and on a trailer. So we'd see the beef cattle, the dairy herd, and the vegetables, because there were vegetables at one point. And to see how the farm worked. And then we'd have lunch out in the sun. And then in the afternoon, we'd go over to Highgrove itself and have a garden tour. And then we'd have tea in the orchard room, or actually in the end, we moved out of the orchard room because thought it'd be nice to have it in a barn. And over about 20 plus years, the people who came on those Highgrove Farm and garden visits constituted an amazing bunch of influential people. And I think a lot of the reason why he is regarded so much as a pioneer of organic farming is because so many people, as you just said, went and had those seeing is believing experiences at Highgrove. So bless him for doing that. And also bless David for putting up with all those people who endlessly came and looked around the farm.
I know we were some of them, actually. I was a student at the Royal Agricultural College at the time, and around came all of us, and he showed us around. It was the first time I ever met him. He definitely didn't remember me from back then. But, it was fascinating to just see what was going on. And to be honest, to see a successful farm, organic farm of a decent scale, it always felt like we were so on the fringes as our little organic farm at home. We never saw other farms, really scaling and thriving. It was always it was more of a passion than a commercial decision. And seeing that really inspired me. But the conversations we had among our group, it was quite dismissive at the time because lots of them were the mainstream ag group. Yeah, because, I was in a cohort which was, I'm 41. So how long ago was that? It was 23 years ago. And so, times have changed a lot since then.
Wow.
And so it's really, I'd love to do that tour again with a new cohort to see how that conversation has shifted within the ag industry, because I bet it's completely different. I bet there's so much more engagement. We had, even though I did the organic agriculture degree, I was in a tiny group and we were very much on the fringes of our ag college society, I suppose. And so
it's funny you should say that. I can't even tell this joke because it's not a joke. It's the truth. So one of David Wilson's sons was probably doing the same course as you did, actually, at Cirencester. And there was a module on organic farming. And I can't even tell you what he said. It's too beyond the pale. But anyway, let's just say that this lecturer described organic farming in a way which was deeply shocking and not complimentary about the subject. Mm-hmm. And I think there was and still probably remains to a lesser degree, a deep prejudice against organic farming, which I think has made it very difficult, funnily enough, for the agricultural colleges to go on the journey that they need to go on. And maybe that's quite an interesting kind of segue into another conversation, which is how are we today? Because if you just said, well, if we went to Cirencester today, we'd find it very different. I think it's on the turn, but I think if you go to Harper Adams or Cirencester or all of the establishment agricultural educational institutions, they're finding it hard. Because I don't know if you'll agree with this, but I think the change that we need to go on now, if we're thinking about how to farm for the future, is radically different from the extractive model which we've got used to, or most farmers are used to, and was taught in all the agricultural colleges and universities. And it's almost embarrassing that they're going to have to reinvent the whole course and look at the educational process through a new lens, which means that if they've been on the old road until now, that's quite difficult. And how that happens, I'm not sure. But I heard the other day that even at this time, when recruitment into universities and colleges studying agriculture should be thriving, that is not the case, because a lot of young people now are looking for the kind of course that you were looking for, organic farming, but they're not finding what they need in the traditional agricultural colleges. And that's probably in part because they can't quite face being as radical as they need to be to start to kind of preach a new gospel, as it were.
Yeah, I think you're bang on there. And do you know what I always say to people when they ask me, what course should I do? I say, don't do a course. The courses are all out of date that I know of. You're not going to be able to get a registered degree in what you need to learn, I'm afraid. So you need to go and learn from all the best people you can find. Spend all of your time and money, because it's very expensive now compared to when we went. But I paid £1,000 a year. Now it's this huge investment into what, to be perfectly blunt, is old and out of date in many cases, not across the board, but in many cases. And so we do need new courses. I'm afraid we need new institutions to bring those courses. And I'm afraid, sadly, we don't have them, as you well know. We need to bring more forward and get better courses out there. And then we need really forward-thinking people taking these courses forward, not teaching anything as fact, in fact, teaching skills to be inquisitive, to be able to challenge what is supposed to be there and move us much further forward than we are. Because I'm afraid our education system, and not just in food, by the way, in health, it's way out of date in terms of what they learn in becoming a doctor. In terms of education, way out of date, completely inappropriate in many ways for the way that children learn, especially about the things we're talking about, and in agriculture itself. So, no, we've got education, I think, is where we start in our whole conversation here.
Well, I think this is also, there's a lot in what you've just said, and it's pretty important because I think the question that occurs to me behind it is if you have these, this sounds patronizing, but if you have these leaders in the conventional systems of education who are, let's say, to be as generous as possible, on the journey, but slightly still unreconstructed in their worldview, how can they be helped? Because these institutions are training the next generation of farmers or doctors or whatever it is. And I think one of the interesting things about the Harmony film was that obviously a lot of material ended up on the cutting room floor. But what I think the Harmony film did justice to what a remarkable human being the king is, but it didn't show quite the extent to which in education, in the faith communities, in agriculture, in all the areas he's shown an interest and launched projects. It didn't actually show how much is going on, including in our field, in the field of agriculture. And I'm wondering just how we can play our part in moving towards an education system for farming which is fit for purpose for the 20th. I don't know what the full answer to that is. I think partly it's our Beacon Farms project, where the farms themselves become educational stages. But it's interesting that the University of Lampeter, which is part of the University of Trinity St David's, Wales, Trinity St David's, recently closed its campus because of what's happening all over the university field, reducing numbers of students. So they literally mothballed the campus, even though there are 600 beds there and a huge educational stage. And right now it's sitting completely idle. But Ceredigion Council, the council of the county where I live, have got interested in taking on part of the campus and turning it into an alternative educational stage for the next generation. And they purchased, with a lot of borrowed money, I think, or maybe money from the Welsh government, a 180-acre farm on the boundary of the campus. And they would like to link with farms around Lampeter, including this farm, so that the farms act as kind of satellites to an educational program, which is much more experiential. And maybe, just maybe, if that project comes into the world and is properly funded and all the things that would need to happen, that might be a bit of an example. Because in the film, again, I'll go back to the Harmony film, there was a lot of material about Dumfries House, which is just, you've not been there, have you?
No, I've not. I really want to go.
It's unbelievable. It's Highgrove on steroids. It really is. And honestly, it is unbelievable. Sorry to make drug references. Basically, he acquired it from a guy called the Marquis of Bute, Johnny Bute. He was a racing driver who had another house called Mount Stuart on an island just off there, Bute, it's called. And I think he had too many stately homes on his books. So he decided to put Dumfries House on the market, and the National Trust for Scotland was about to buy it. But then they couldn't afford it because it had this amazing Chippendale set of furniture, which was commissioned for the house. And apparently it was the last set of Chippendale furniture that was actually still in its original home. And the Prince, it was put on the market. The National Trust for Scotland couldn't raise enough money and he couldn't bear it. So basically, eventually, Johnny Bute, as he was known, he decided to send all the Chippendale furniture down to Christie's, or I think it's Christie's or Sotheby's in London. And it all got loaded into some Pantechnicons and it was going down the M6. And the Prince intervened and he said, no, I'll buy it. I'll just borrow the money to buy it. And at the time, he got into serious trouble. I mean, the critics were really having a field day. They said, who is this irresponsible prince to spend millions and millions? I can't remember what the buying price was. I think it might have been, it's either 25 million or it might have been even 45 million, including the furniture. He didn't have the money, so it was literally loans to finance it. And then this unbelievable project. And you might think, oh, what's he doing? Just recreating a stately home. But it's so not National Trust if you see it. And it's not going to a house and seeing how they used to live in the 18th century or something like that. It's totally not. He's given the whole thing back to the community. And the locals it's really an impoverished part of southwest Scotland, about an hour south of Glasgow. Really tough. The locals adore it and they regard it as their home because it's open 365 days a year. All the gardens are totally open to the public for free. It's mind-blowing what they've done there. And they are now running courses, lots of different courses, and they're educating people in all these new skills, as you saw in the film. By the way, it's the real thing, what you saw in the film. It's just as impressive if you go there. I'd argue more so. And they now want to do stuff in butchery and courses related to, sustainable agriculture, because there's a 1,000-acre farm round the house. And the guy who was featured in the film, I've forgotten his name now, I know him a little bit. Lovely man who came from a really challenged family and his father committed suicide. And then he was given a job there. And he's just, you can see he's just an authentic person who's been, through a complete transformation as a result of the influence of that place. And that's just Dumfries House. Go on the pilgrimage. Well worth it.
I will. Oh, thank you. I'm definitely going to do that, actually. That sounds like a good one. I'm going to do that. I obviously know about it a little bit, but no, you've convinced me. I'm going to go on my way up there because I think you see people around the country doing all this sort of stuff bit by bit, but, and doing their best. Absolutely. We've got loads of people locally who are doing little courses on, woodworking or thatching or all these types of things. Fantastic work, but it's all obviously very limited by scale. Whereas the king does have that ability to be able to raise £40 million back a while ago, by the way. So it won't be 40 million now, I'm sure. And so, that's an amazing thing to be able to do, to be able to roll this out on a much bigger scale. And it's the same with the towns as well, isn't it?
Exactly. And he's the world's great convener, as was said by Dame Amelia Fawcett in the film. She's been involved with the royal household for a long time. But actually, it's more than that, isn't it? Because people gave to the project, partly because he was king. But the point is, if you are that kind of person, it's easy for it to go wrong. But I think people who have given money for his various projects have done so for a right motive. And if you go there, you can feel the money was not misspent because it's to the benefit of the wider community. And the energy of it is spreading and inspiring people. So you don't go, I'm just speaking for me. You don't go to Dumfries House and think, it's all very well for him, he's done this. You think, no, this is like an educational cathedral, to use the sort of analogy with the church. And the church is relevant here. So I just go there and I think we need more places like that, not as big as Dumfries House, because we haven't all got access to those kind of funds, but in our own way, on our own farm here, what we've done with the threshing barn and the bedrooms now and the kitchen is we've created a kind of mini Dumfries House because we want to play our part in this humble parish of Garthelly of spreading the knowledge. And I think so that I really, truly was inspired by Dumfries House because I could feel the spirit of the thing behind what he was trying to do was exactly what we need to spread. So that's good use of money. Not all money is well spent these days, but that money was well spent.
No, that's great. And we're doing the same sort of thing down with us. It's great.
There you are. And also faith. Because, I've touched on this earlier. He has a building called the Sanctuary, which again features in the film, which is rather lovely, which was designed by a man called Keith Critchlow. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's died now, but he was a big advocate of sacred geometry. So the original designs for this sanctuary, which is all built out of cob and stone from Highgrove, is tiny, and it was measured by Keith Critchlow to reflect his own physical dimensions, because that's all part of the sacred geometry thing.
Right.
So he goes there. Every time he's back there, he has a moment of contemplation and prayer every day. So he's walking the talk, and his sanctuary, which he built for the millennium, is part of that. And again, how lovely is that? It's a tiny little cell. And he's a man of faith and faiths. And that's another thing which I don't think features enough in the film, is what he's done for the faith communities, because he sees that all the great faith traditions are connected at their root and at the source. So it's ridiculous to go to war over, different faiths. They're all totally connected to the divine.
Of course.
And I think he's a reflection of that. And he has helped heal a lot of the rifts which exist in the various faith communities.
Yeah, I think that is a very big part of it for him. You've seen it already as a king. He's gone way further than any other monarch has been in terms of crossing those faiths. It was in the news because it was such a new and interesting thing, but she's obviously been doing for a very long time.
Yeah.
So it's just carrying on the norm.
Well, let's flip into today.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard this week's food program, which was inspired by a conference in London. I think it's called something like the Sustainable Food Systems Conference, and it was held in London, I think
correct.
last week or maybe the week before. I didn't go. I have been to previous versions of that, but he went there, and there was very strong representation from just about everybody in the food world, or the food industry as it's known. I think that's another unfortunate term we should try to move away from. But the boss of Tesco was there. Well, because we used all this language, and it's all about factories and industry, isn't it? And farming is culture, and it's community, and it's craft. It's not a factory. I think it's almost as if the farming community think it's grown up to use industrial language. I want to move away from that personally. But anyway, they were all there. All the big cheeses were there. And Dan Saladino, who's, I think, a brilliant presenter, met and interviewed quite a few of them, the Henry Dimblebys and the woman who's head of the Climate Change Committee, and a remarkable doctor called David Unwin, who was interviewed right at the end of the program. What struck me about it, you listened to it, didn't you?
I did, yeah, I've listened.
So right at the end of the program, this doctor, David Unwin, was interviewed and saying that in America now, weirdly enough, presumably because of RFK, they've just reformed the guidance for what people should eat. And he was saying, David Unwin was saying, and he's got a practice, a surgery up in northwest England. And he said, I never would have dreamt that in America, of all places, the new guidance for what people should eat is exactly aligned with what I've been telling my patients for decades, which is that they should move towards real foods, towards whole fat milk, butter, all those kind of things which were demonized for decades, and fresh vegetables, obviously, and protein, but a diet which would promote health rather than be part of the problem. But what I thought about the program, which I recommend everybody should download on BBC Sounds food program 10:15 Saturday evening, is that it revealed that everyone who was interviewed agreed that we've got a terrible, terrible problem with our farming and food systems, but actually not many of them knew what to do about it. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's they came up with a figure that 30% of our global emissions come from agriculture still, and whether that's true or not is really by the by, because it means either way, we're a massive problem in so many ways. Don't get me wrong, we're also feeding the world. So that is, it's a big job to do, and it's important that we carry on doing it. But I do think we are in a situation where we do tend to have a lot of scientists, academics, politicians, you only have to look in our own government. The people that are making the policy decisions have no real knowledge of food systems. And when I say food systems, I do include agriculture, but I include processing, transport systems, and all the rest of it, energy to go with it. And back to the really important part, the social aspects of it. They don't have that full understanding. Does anyone? I'm not sure. I do feel like, that is a lot of the work the Sustainable Food Trust does. So hopefully we have a reasonable understanding. And so I do think we need to start coming out of this now, because I think we've all agreed that it's happening and it's a problem and we need to sort it out. So we need to start having much more contact with organizations and farmers who are doing the right thing and the right way, and trying to design some schemes, some new food channels, new selling models to maybe move us forward. Because at the moment, globally, we're in a real pickle. And, and it's just beginning, because you only have to look at water scarcity to know that there's a lot worse to come yet if we don't start fixing our systems and start working with nature rather than against. So, yeah, I think that's our challenge next, I think, Patrick, is we need to get in the heart of it and start trying to make our recommendations to try and find some solutions to which we can practically deliver as farmers. Because I will always say this, farmers are not trying to destroy nature. They would love to work with nature. They just want to make a living, and they need to be able to understand what to do next. Why should they have to come up with all of the solutions themselves? They do need help, some of them, and many of them, in fact. So we need to be there with those solutions and access to markets and all those kind of things. So yeah, it's a big job.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to your point about what do we know, I think our knowledge is obviously partial. I feel as if I'm only at the beginning of knowing what I need to know, but we are practitioners. And I think what has been left out in all these debates, which always take place in cities, by the way, they almost never take place in the place where they need to take place, which is on working farms, is that the people involved very often rarely visit farms and are so removed from practical agriculture that they wouldn't really know what the solution was, even if it was told to them, because they wouldn't realize its importance and its relevance. So I think that I think we do have a role to play. And one of the things I want to do is to try to use this farm stage and other farm stages in the Beacon Farms network to influence the influencers, because I think if you can find a way to get a person who's in a position of some influence to visit a farm which is being run in a sustainable way based on biological principles with lots of healthy people, healthy crops, healthy plants, healthy animals, and healthy soils. At some level, it's not even intellectual. You just see it and you think, wow, there's something going on here which I need to know more about and to scale. And I think that was what, by the way, there's a guy who came here in that ilk, a man called Noel Quinn, who I only met through the King because he did this sustainable markets initiative he launched about 6 years ago,
There you go
5
again,
years ago.
the convener.
Yeah, he's the great convener. So one of them was the chief executive of HSBC Bank. And he's subsequently left and been knighted. So he's now Sir Noel Quinn. And I was in New York at Climate Week, this 2 years ago now, 3 years ago maybe. And I was with him, and I only met him because of this. Otherwise, I never thought I'd meet these people. I ended up meeting Noel Quinn. So I said to him, we were just in a conversation, tower building in New York. And I said, you should come see my farm someday, kind of slightly just throwing it out there. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, maybe I will. And good as his word, he did. And he came.
No way.
I think it was in September or something like that. And we'd done 3 cuts of silage, and I took him into this field with incredible aftermath. And he went round our cheese dairy, put on the pats and everything, and got a photograph of him. And he came, by the way, with bodyguards. It's like a whole entourage.
Really?
Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah, because I guess because he was head of such a big bank, they were scared for him or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was a really nice, he was probably with us about 4 or 5 hours. He bought an oak tree, which we planted in the yard. And he went in this field and he said, there's something going on here that we need to scale. He could see it, and so you influence those people and you do plant a seed, I think. So it's not just about children, which is probably the most important thing we need to do of everything. We do need to get people who get it. And even though they can't subsequently immediately act, because even if you're head of a big international bank, if the money system and the people and the investors and the children and the voters and the eaters of food are not behind you, there's a limited amount you can do. But if you know there's something that could work, if it was scaled, that's already a step in the right direction.
Definitely. Even just over the last year, it's been a real exciting thing for me. So I've been doing this Nuffield Farming Scholarship. I've become part of the SFT and doing these innovative farmers trials and all sorts of other things, basically getting out and about there, trying to talk to people and just get some sort of action going. And it has been amazing that those networking ideas get everyone together and suddenly these things start to roll. And I only have to look at my LinkedIn profile of who the people who've added me over the last year have been like, it's just, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Why are they following what I'm up to as well? So these little influences do spiral. And I hope that we can really get things going in the right direction. Patrick, we are at an hour of rambling about this, and I think we are out of time, but I'm still so excited about all of this kind of stuff. And so everyone at home, please do comment and share what you're up to, that you think, what do we need to do next? How are we going to do this positively? No negative comments, please. We want to be working towards a more positive future. We're not going to moan about what's happening. We're going to say it's going to be better in the future. So please do like and share whatever you can. And please, make sure you're following all the rest of our podcasts because we really enjoy doing them. We really hope you enjoy listening. Patrick, anything more to say before we say goodbye?
No, it's been great talking to you. I do watch the Harmony film on Amazon Prime. I think it's worth a watch. It's a message of inspiration and hope in a troubled world. Exactly what we need.
Yep. I thought I wouldn't enjoy it. I really enjoyed it. And so I think it's a good one. Go and watch that one. Yeah. Have a lovely day, everyone.
Right.
And I shall see you all soon. See you back in the UK fairly soon, Patrick, I think. But I'm here a little while longer. But let's catch up on what we've been up to next time. And then we've got a few other episodes in between, which I hope you'll enjoy, that Patrick's been doing some wonderful interviews. Have a lovely day.
Well, I'll tell you what, just to end on that, I'm currently talking to a man called Peter Seger, who's a great friend of mine.
Oh, yes.
And we realised that we both have spanned in our own personal experience quite a chapter of interesting history of the development of the organic movements. So I'm thinking they're kind of the organic history tapes. So maybe they can feature as well in future podcasts.
That is a fascinating story. The history of organic. It should be a movie. It's a crazy one, really. How on earth did it happen? It's amazing.
Well, Peter in particular, he was in the thick of it. Do you know who Fritz Schumacher was, who wrote Small is Beautiful? So I was just talking to him yesterday actually, and Fritz Schumacher came to his farm in the 70s before he died. He was an economic advisor to the Cold War. He was an industrialist. He helped rebuild Germany after the war, and he wrote Small is Beautiful, which was, a seminal book. And so that's interesting, just one little segment of the history.
Well, I know it'll be interesting. So keep an eye out, everyone, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.